Hello, Professor. My name is Charlie Baynton, and my project is on the Rosetta Stone, which is in the British Museum. And my project is mostly pictures because you don't want to read, you want to be presented to. Um, I'll be doing the reading with my notes. So, well, let's get right into it. So, for thousands and thousands of years, the history of ancient Egypt was mostly a mystery. You know, what gods did they sacrifice to? Who did they worship? Why did they preserve their dead? Why did they bury them with the treasures? Why did they mummify them? And of course, how they build the pyramids, how they build all these amazing temples that are just still to this day incredible feats of architecture and engineering. And by the time Jesus was around, even 2,000 years ago, the ancient Egyptians were still ancient. Like nobody really knew much about them. But that was going to change with this. So during the late 1700s, the British and the French were fighting a massive war. And the French general, Napoleon Bonaparte, right here in the top right, he proposed leading the French army on an invasion of Egypt. As you can see, Egypt is right here. And he thought that if the French could control Egypt, obviously they would control kind of the crossroads between Europe, Asia, and Africa. And then they would control trade and eventually become the most powerful country in the world. Sorry. Okay, so on July 1st, 1978, Napoleon's military sailed into Egypt's port city of Alexandria. And in addition to the 38,000 soldiers they brought, Napoleon also brought 167 of his top scientists and scholars because, as well as a great military leader, Napoleon was kind of an history nerd. He heard all the mystery and all the legend and kind of magical power of Egypt, right? And he wanted to kind of harness that power. This was the land where the kings and the royalty was considered gods by their subject. And, they ruled over the world's greatest civilization for 2,000 years. So Napoleon was really determined to learn their secrets, how they ruled, and maybe so he could, use some of those secrets to rule with almost absolute power, just like the pharaohs did. And so the French came into Egypt and they blew through the Egyptian defenses. And so the 167 scientists and scholars that I mentioned had free reign over all this Egyptian tombs and everything. So they really scattered across Egypt, exploring tombs, climbing, the pyramids, climbing monuments, and they were studying and sketching everything inside, as you can see here. This is obviously today, but this is basically what they were doing. They were examining what was inside all these amazing tombs. And Napoleon demanded to know everything that was going on, every interesting finding that was going on. He had to know immediately. That's kind of why he was there, along with conquering Egypt. He wanted to know the history of ancient Egypt. And so, as I mentioned, the British and the French were at war with each other. And so within weeks of the French conquering Egypt, the British came in and they gave it to the French. They attacked all their ships. They destroyed a ton of their ships, and they forced. Napoleon actually escaped, but he fled, kind of leaving his army and his team behind. And so while the abandoned French army fought to stay alive, the scientists knew they didn't have much time. So they continued to uncover Egypt, and they learned so much, and they kind of gave birth to modern Egyptology. And so In mid-July 1799, as the British siege kind of continued, the French were bolstering their defenses. And you see right here, this is a town called Rosetta, and the Rosetta Stone, and it's really right in the corner here between the Nile River. This is the Nile River and the Mediterranean Sea, and it's kind of an ancient town. But French soldiers started trying to rebuild the ancient walls of Rosetta to kind of use as a fort to bolster their defenses. And the thing about ancient Egyptians is they would often recycle old material, old stone from their old buildings, old temples, and use them to build new ones. And so this is what Rosetta looks like now. While the walls were being torn apart, a soldier actually stumbled across a stone tablet, and they noticed something very interesting about the tablet. Carved on the stone were three types of writing. There was Greek and a common Egyptian script that they knew what it was, but couldn't really translate it. Very old, called Demotic, and most importantly, there were hieroglyphs on it. And ironically, it was actually a soldier that discovered the tablet, not a scientist or a scholar. And people often say, thank goodness it was a French soldier and not a British one, because the French were perhaps a little bit more intellectually minded than the British at the time. And this is the stone they found. It's the Rosetta Stone. So here you can see, this is some of the Greek letters on the stone, and Demotic, again an ancient Egyptian language, and of course hieroglyphs, which is the famous ancient Egypt, pharaohs, that kind of language. But unfortunately, here I'll go back. The stone, as you can see, it's broken, it's incomplete. The top and kind of the right side and the bottom, it's all damaged. So the Greek language was translated, because that's the only one they could translate at the time, and it was translated as a decree honoring a Greek pharaoh, Ptolemy V. But most of the writing really wasn't all that interesting until the last line, which said, "This decree shall be inscribed on a stele, which is a slab of hard stone, in sacred and native and Greek characters," which is sacred is hieroglyphic and native is Demotic. So this means that they all say the same thing. So they're thinking, if Egypt's ancient language could be finally translated and understood, could their former glory and secrets also be revealed along with that? So translating the stone was incredibly difficult. No one had been able to speak or read Demotic or hieroglyphs for over 2,000 years. So nobody knew what any of the Egyptian symbols or words meant. Also, the stone was obviously broken, like I mentioned. So there was only 14 lines of hieroglyphs, 32 lines of Demotic, and 53 lines of Greek. But it was tough to kind of match it up, And so, there was no way of knowing which words matched up with which. And when the French discovered it, but they would not have it in their hands for very long, because soon after, the British forces had taken over and forced the French to surrender. But word of the stone had already spread kind of across Europe. And during negotiations, British officers demanded the stone be given to them, which made the French very, very upset, as you can imagine. And the French actually tried to hide the stone, but ended up having to give it up at gunpoint. And the British ended up bringing the stone back to England, but the French had already made copies. So the race was on to see who could decipher the ancient languages first and unlock the secrets of the stone. So after its arrival in London in 1802, copies of the Rosetta Stone text began to spread, especially to universities throughout Europe, and kind of the race to decipher it, one of the world's greatest detective mysteries, began. And as language specialists studied the relationship between the three scripts, No clear pattern was evident. They all knew the texts were saying the same thing, but no one could really figure out how to match them up. And over 15 years after the stone was discovered, there was still nothing definitively discovered from the text, and scholars were starting to think like, "Oh man, this isn't going to work. That the mystery's still a mystery." And then eventually, in the summer of 1814, a 41-year-old problem solver named Thomas Young decided to spend his summer break at his vacation home trying to solve the mystery of the Rosetta Stone. Young thought the mysticism, the magic surrounding ancient Egypt was kind of nonsense. He wasn't really into that. He just thought it was an old civilization. But he truly just loved solving puzzles and solving mysteries, and he just wanted to crack it. And so in 1818, he actually became the first person. This is Thomas Young. He became the first person to finally match these the hieroglyphs with the Greek letters, and he discovered that this translates to a king, Ptolemy's, and his success really garnered the public's attention. And as it did this, another man in France was also obsessed with deciphering the stone, and this is Jean-Francois Champollion, and he built upon Young's work by discovering another pharaoh that's in the Rosetta Stone, Cleopatra, and he kind of compared the two names to discover the characters P, O, and L, and then he continued to use this knowledge to decipher the name of another king, Ramesses, and that is when he really started to crack the code, Ramesses. So he used his knowledge of another older Egyptian language, not as old as the other two, but a little bit older, called Coptic, plus Thomas Young's discoveries, plus he had a vast knowledge of ancient Egyptian history, and so he kind of became the first person to really crack the code of the hieroglyphs. And Thomas Young, he was happy to see somebody moving along his work, but Champollion did not really give him credit, which made him very upset. And so Champollion's work did not stop there, and by 1824 he actually built a hieroglyphic alphabet containing 21 letters, and in 1828 he finally got to go on an expedition to travel up the Nile River and see see Egypt for himself. And so when he got to Egypt, he was kind of like a kid in a candy store, right? He was literally the first person in thousands of years that was able to read Egyptian scripture right off the walls of the temples. And so this kind of meant that Egypt was no longer silent. It was now speaking to us from the past for the first time. And we know now when the pharaohs ruled, we can see what their faces look like through the sarcophagi and which temples they prayed in. And eventually, after he left Europe, he returned to Paris, and he had enough material to write the definitive history of Egypt. But unfortunately, he would never get the chance, as on March 4th, 1831, Jean-Francois Champollion passed away. And as the years went by after his death, more and more was discovered about life in ancient Egypt, and it really became clear how similar the ancient Egyptians were to us. They were normal people who lived normal lives. You can see they're putting on makeup, and they found out they wrote letters to each other. They had literature. They even wrote bank statements. So even today, we're still just scratching the surface of discovering the mysteries of ancient Egypt, but the Rosetta Stone sure helped us get a lot closer to discovering those mysteries. So, thank you.